By the way, dance is a great training for the rabbinate because you got to have balance and flexibility, and a little technique goes a long way as well. So just a very personal story about the high holidays and sermons, and then we'll dive into the deeper water. So for the last 30 plus years, I have this dream every single year. It always comes during the month of Elul, and it's always the same dream. So the dream goes as follows. I'm standing up in front of a huge number of wonderful Jewish people coming for deep nourishment. And I'm standing there, and I got nothing. I got no piece of paper. I don't have a little misa. I got nothing. And I inevitably, when I have that dream, I wake up, I'm drenched in sweat, and my wife looks over at me and she goes, "Did you have the dream?" I said, "I just had the dream." She said, "Good. Now we can get back to our lives." So I understand that that dream may not just be my own dream. I think maybe one or two of you have had that dream. And what I want to do in this second time with you is to bore down on something that I think is really slippery and it's really crucial. So a wonderful longtime member of my congregation in Westchester came up to me right before Slichot, and very, very conservative politically individual, very smart individual. He came up, put his arm around me. He said, "What's it going to be this year? Politics or religion?" I said, well, you can't actually do the exorcism or the surgery to take out the things that actually connect those two. What I want to do this afternoon is to get into some of the hard water that shows that to pull out the political implications in the most positive sense. It was a wonderful session I was just a part of between the opening and lunch. Brilliant session about how we frame what really is politics. Is it partisan? Is it dirty? Is it the stuff that reflects badly on our political system or other countries' political systems? Or is there something so unbelievably fundamental that to take out that part that is literally implicating everything we do in our lives, so that we would have a religion that was literally worried about the time of prayer or some of the very important particulars, and we wouldn't have a religious tradition that spoke to the biggest issues and the most important issues. We simply can't sever. I mean, do we want to worry about whether people wear kippot, talitot, tefillin, or do we want to clothe the naked? Do we want to worry about welcoming Shabbat and not worry about welcoming the stranger or the immigrant? Do we want to think about all these really important Jewish questions without living the implications of what all these critical issues demand of us? And I think that when the day is done, I think we ultimately have to embed the everything together, intertwine them in ways that make them holistic. So I actually want to talk to you about God, I want to talk to you about ritual, and I want to talk to you about social justice this afternoon. And I couldn't imagine talking about one of those without talking about all of those. So we had a little hurricane in New York this past year. And God bless, the weather reports told us that the hurricane was coming. And my wife, who's a lot smarter than I am, said, "Do you remember all the storms we have and we don't have power for weeks? God invented Home Depot." And all of your colleagues and friends in our immediate community have gone out and bought generators. So I said, I could do that. That's not a problem. So got ourselves a generator in anticipation of the storm that was coming. And the storm, they said was going to be one of the great storms of the century. And so we're home, and we lose power within the first, hour. And it turns out our power will be off for 3 weeks and no phone, all those things. So I'm sitting there, and the generator, thank God. Thank God I had a few people help me actually learn how to turn it on, and you have to actually put some things in to keep it going. Generator's working. And so my wife asked me, because there are trees going down literally by the minute. These really big, eastern trees in our neighborhood are coming down, taking not only wires down, but landing on some of our neighbors' homes. So my wife asked me the kind of, not the Talmudic question that I was hoping she would ask me. She asked me about our insurance. I said, well, I don't know. We bought the house, we bought insurance, and I don't know, we just keep renewing it. She said, well, is it going to cover this storm? And I said, I'm not sure. She said, well, we're not going anywhere, and there's a lot of free time here. Would you like to check? So I said, yeah, I was just coming around to that right now. So I took one of the flashlights that actually still had some juice in it, and I went and I found the policy, and I took it out, and I skimmed through, and I found the bad news. When it comes to the hurricane, basically, when it comes to the earthquake, when it comes to, I don't know where they thought volcanoes were going to be in North America, but basically these are categorized in a lump phrase. These are, in fact, acts of God. So I told her that good news is I found the policy. I understood the policy. The bad news, however, is that whatever happens to our home and to our ability to stay here will be our responsibility. And the really troubling news is that somehow God is on the hook for Hurricane Sandy, for Hurricane Katrina, for the tsunami that struck the Pacific Indian Ocean rim. And the challenge is not just for our homeowners, but for the core of our faith. I mean, how do I have a faith where God's acts in my life and in our collective lives have to do with things that can't be reimbursed, that literally could tear us apart? So it's kind of like the guy who wakes up late for a job interview, and he quickly takes a shower, grabs breakfast, and he jumps in his car and he heads to downtown, and it only works if you're in a place where there's a lot of traffic and where it's difficult to park. So I know that couldn't be Los Angeles, so I'll once again just locate this story in New York if I could. So he's driving around, he's got his interview at 9 o'clock, and he's just circling the neighborhood in Manhattan. He can't find a spot. So he finally just looks up at God and says, God, if you can just get me a spot, just a spot where I can leave my car, I will be the guy who will be there every Shabbat, every holiday, every Jewish value. I will be your most ardent follower. He drives another couple of feet, and all of a sudden he sees a spot. He pulls in, and he goes, don't worry, no bother, I found one myself. So I think that all of us in the room are kind of agents for God's branch offices. And the big question that's coursing through the Machzor isn't about how to organize our governance. It's not about whether or not a particular kind of outreach is going to be the right kind of outreach. But what's coursing through our Machzor are texts and teachings all about the core meaning of our lives and our universe. And if, again, we're going to get to what the tradition is all about, we got to get inside those. So what I'd like to do with you is to focus on the Unatana Tokef and acts of God and earthquakes and lots of other things referenced in the Unatana Tokef. Because for me, every single religious question that I have is awakened by that text. And I'm sure no matter where we fit in liturgical or other spectrums of Jewish thought and practice, that the Unatana Tokef, literally for many of us, if not most of us, is a kind of holy of holies of both meaning, power, and difficulty in simply reciting it, let alone understanding it. So you have in the key phrase, Baruch Hashanah, it is written on Yom Kippur, it's sealed, how many shall pass on, how many shall come to be, who shall live, and who shall die. So the question is, what does that mean? And I'm sure every one of us has given a great sermon or 2 or 3 or 10 on that. I want to offer a different frame if I could. If you thought of it, let's talk afterwards. So the question is, the Unatana Tokef, again, not to be pejorative, but it kind of sounds like God is deciding who's been naughty and nice and what's going to be in the coming year. And we have within our domain certain things we can do that will temper the severity of that decree, but there's still a kind of theology implicit in the Unatana Tokef that can absolutely be stunning, can be disconnecting, and for some it can be inspiring. So the question is, if God literally decides that fate once and for all, because of a whole series of acts of God will be, in a sense, the answer to whether we shall live or die, I personally would not be a believer if that were the only opportunity or the option for understanding the prayer or for what it means to be a religious person in the 21st century or probably any century. So I want to bring you a philosophical text from a woman who is a philosopher of law. Her name is Judith Sklar. She taught at Harvard, and she wrote a book called The Faces of Injustice. And my text to counterbalance the Unatana Tokef is her text from her book. And she says, again, I think of this as responding directly to Unatana Tokef. She didn't write it as that. So to me, this is a response to, and who by earthquake? She writes, the modern age has many birthdays. One of them is the Lisbon earthquake of 1755. What makes it such a memorable disaster is not the destruction of a wealthy and splendid city, nor the death of some 10,000 to 15,000 people who perished in its ruins, but the intellectual response it evoked throughout Europe. It was the last time that the ways of God to man were the subject of general public debate and discussed by the finest minds of the day. It was the last significant outcry against divine injustice. Sklar argues, and she finishes with this statement. The earthquake was a natural event. It was a disaster only because people had built houses 6 or 7 stories high. In a desert or a village of huts, it would have caused no injuries. It is our own fault. So she's writing in the 20th century, but the moment that she's focused on is 1755 and an earthquake that hit Lisbon, which according to the great philosophical writings of that day, literally were not just a cause of destruction in Lisbon, but it shook the very foundations of faith and even philosophers' understanding of the world. So I want to not leave us in the 1700s in Lisbon. I want to bring us to a few contemporary disasters, a few that we've lived with. And by the way, in the relative framework of disasters, Hurricane Sandy was basically a picnic compared to the others. So I want to just focus in this moment about the earthquake in Haiti, because I had the privilege and the horror of getting to Haiti just a little while after the earthquake happened. And I had the privilege of going with Ruth Messenger and a group of colleagues. Just a little aside, I have a doctor who's really good about getting me the right vaccinations. You go to places like Los Angeles, you don't need vaccinations. You go to sub-Saharan Africa, you got to get a lot. So I didn't know what the rules were about Haiti. So literally before we hustled out, I called up my doctor, and he was with a patient, but the nice receptionist said, well, Rick, where are you going? I said, well, I'm going to Haiti. She said, well, there are no Jewish people there. I said, I know. I said, that's not the only reason I would go somewhere. But at this moment, literally over 1 million of God's children are still in desperate recovery, and 300,000 have already died. So what happened in Haiti? 300,000 people died in an earthquake that was only, again, only Californians will take this with a grain of salt, only 7 points on the Richter scale. And the devastation was and remains, literally beyond even description. So how is it that 300,000 people died? Well, I got to just do a frame comparison. 1 month after the Haiti earthquake, there was an earthquake in Chile. It was an earthquake that was measured at 8.8 on the Richter scale. In that earthquake, 521 people died. So how is it possible that in the Haiti earthquake, literally 600 times more people died, and the Chile earthquake was far more intense? And the simple answer is Judith Shklar's answer. Answer is that if you had any building codes, if you had any responsible, governmental authorities, the number of people who would have died in Haiti would have been already too many, but it would have been a few. So the natural disaster is the earthquake. It is a misfortune. But when misfortune becomes injustice, that's really a large part of what not only is going on in the Unatana Tokef, but it's going on in our own struggle with which part of this enterprise is ours, which part of this enterprise is God's. God bless you. And it would be simple to make it an easy demarcation. But I'd like to kind of walk us through some of the particulars of the Unatana Tokef and to see if we can't have it resonate as a theological and as a human responsibility prayer. So let's take another phrase. Who by earthquake? Again, in China, in Haiti, and other places, when there are, and by the way, when you build here in Los Angeles, and I remember as a kid in Orange County, when we had an earthquake in the late 60s, and the chandeliers were swaying, and I remember being in bed, and there were things that happened, but we build with that reality. We know that we live, in a earthquake area. We pay attention. So the question of earthquakes is ultimately a question of public policy and about human responsibility to keep misfortune from becoming injustice. So the question of who by hunger. Again, famine, hunger, these are some of the natural forces of the universe. Well, if we're going to say that hunger and famine are simply part of, the acts of God, what kind of religious responsibility would we be demonstrating? So it turns out the World Health Organization estimates that 1/3 of the world is well fed, 1/3 is underfed, and 1/3 is starving. Now, again, this would be a pretty good little thing to dig out on Yom Kippur when people use the word, I'm starving. I mean, I always love that when my kids, tell me, between 12 o'clock lunch and 2 o'clock a snack, I'm starving. What does it mean that 1/3 of the human race is starving? What does it mean that 1/3 is underfed and 1/3 is well-fed? When we gather for any one of our tefillot, you could name it, for Shacharit on Rosh Hashanah, first day or second day, Kol Nidre for Yom Kippur, you pick it. But during any one of our prayer services, 4,000 people at least will die somewhere on the planet who are hungry. Okay? Now, I can say, all this is in God's hands, but this is so fundamentally not in God's hands. This is so fundamentally within our capacity to feed every person on the planet and then some is a choice, it is a decision, it is a responsibility. More than 4 million people will die in the coming year from hunger. So, are those deaths the result of divine punishment, misfortune, or our neglect? Who by water? So water, you can do a number of different natural disasters. Let's, if we can, just think about the tsunami that hit the Indian Ocean and was literally one of the worst disasters in the history of the world, recorded history. And it turns out that tsunamis can't be prevented, but they can be predicted. We have the technology to predict. The same way I knew to go get a generator from Home Depot. We knew to get water. We knew to get food. We knew there would be a hurricane to hit our home. We actually know when there will be a tsunami, and there is in place the Pacific Tsunami Warning System. It's based in Honolulu, and it monitors all seismic activity that occurs anywhere within the Pacific Ocean. Tsunami warnings would have saved hundreds of thousands of lives. The technology exists, it just didn't get to the people who are in harm's way. So why is there no such system in place in the Indian Ocean? A tragic misfortune became a grave injustice. Who by water? Let's stay with water a little bit more. Let's come a little closer to home. The Indian Ocean is far away. Can we do Hurricane Katrina? Hurricane Sandy, was difficult, and it did devastate lots of people who have very little right along the coast, particularly in New York and the Rockaways. But Hurricane Katrina literally was devastation that really was overwhelming. And by the way, did you know, have you like me, cringe every time there's a horrific natural disaster for the first religious leader who's going to open his or her mouth, right, and tell us why it happened. Some of them from our own tradition, some of them have been chief rabbis of Israel, some of them have been head of the moral majority, and they know why these natural disasters happen, because they don't just have a prayer like Unatana Toka, they know how to understand why everything happens and God's intentionality to everything that goes on in the world. And by the way, the nuns that we talked about this morning, the ones who have no religious affiliation, most of them are so unbelievably repulsed by the voice of religion, literally invoking divine causality for things that, of course, no human being can ever speak of as if they know. But literally, faith is destroyed alongside the horrific devastation that's caused in physical terms. So when we think of Hurricane Katrina, and again, we're still rebuilding in New Orleans. We're still trying to build the protections that should have been in place before. So let me start with a Republican and move to a Democrat, so you know that I'm an equal opportunity offender. President Bush, the second President Bush, addressing the nation right after Hurricane Katrina hit, called it a blind and random tragedy. But the blindness wasn't God. The blindness was our public policy. Because in 2003, we slashed all the funding that frankly would have allowed there to be far more effective flood control for the entire New Orleans community. But if you prefer a Democrat's blindness, let me suggest that in 1965, in response to the swamping of New Orleans after Hurricane Betsy, the Army Corps of Engineers was far more interested in developing economic projects than in saving lives during other hurricanes. So in thinking about where is God in Hurricane Katrina, where is God Hurricane Betsy, I think one of the things that we see is public policy is oftentimes where we fall most vulnerable to the pain of the unknown and the pain of what we don't do but could do. Who by plague? Again, we could name various plagues. I'm going to simply name the plague of cancer that is certainly found throughout each of our families, I'm sure, and through every one of our communities. So I know that we can tell all kinds of things, but just a story to indicate the plague that we talk of. And again, a lot of times people who don't do hospice work and don't do chaplaincy will talk about illness also in the language of punishment. So I want to just tell one story. It's about a woman named Karen Dove, and she worked really hard to keep her health insurance. And of course, if you think we're talking about plague and cancer and health insurance, that we already solved that with the Affordable Health Care Act. What we know is that there is a huge movement at this very moment to keep it from ever really having the positive benefits. So she worked incredibly hard to hold on to some of her protection with her health insurance. But her pulmonary disease interfered with her ability to be an apartment manager. So she lost her job and she lost her health care. And after months of suffering acute abdominal pain, she desperately sought medical help, though most doctors would not even examine her because she was lacking insurance. When she was finally seen, her cancer had progressed long past the point of early detection that might have been less expensive, less invasive, and might have saved her life. She was diagnosed with stage 3 ovarian cancer, which, as I think many of us know, is almost always fatal. She underwent, in that stage, surgery, chemotherapy. She couldn't afford it. The cost of her treatment was $80,000, though she and her husband earned only $16,000 annually. She lost her battle, and she died a little while ago. Why did God make her suffer so? I'm suggesting it's not the right question. Our public policy kept her from having a chance against a modern plague. Her death is not just sad, it's an injustice. Who by sword? You can do this now, I'm sure, on your own. You don't need me to belabor who by sword. I went to a really powerful session earlier today on gun violence. They didn't mention guns in the Unatan Tokef, but I think that's what they put swords in there for, so that we'd understand that those who will die by sword will not be suffering from an act of God. So just a few of the things that I heard this morning in our session here. By the way, a phenomenal day. All of you who put this day together with enough substance, enough depth, and different voices to nourish all of us and to challenge us to find messages that would really speak. So Lauren Liebs shared very personally and very powerfully about gun violence. And she just rehearsed what we know is that 30,000 deaths will occur this year from gun violence. And she shared a really simple little story that when you make hooded sweatshirts for kids now, you can't have the strings in there that we'd all use to keep our hoods nice and tight when the weather is blowing or when we just want to look cool. Why? Because it's dangerous. So we got a government, we got a society that knows about dangerous things. And hooded sweatshirts are dangerous things. By the way, a separate one could be about Trayvon Martin and hooded sweatshirts. But let's just stay with the string in a sweatshirt. So that's my big takeaway. Who by sword? Who by guns? God, how could you do this? Where in our society, where in our tradition can we find the strength to do the difficult but critical work of doing that work? Again, if there's, in your mind a thought about Afghanistan and our government's intervention in certain places, we could do sword in terms of public policy and of fighting wars. But I just want to move from those frames that I think really are legitimately a part of what either binds us to our tradition and a faith that will give us the ability to understand our world and the ability to bring people who have disconnected from our world, because the stuff that we talk about is either disaffecting or even at times offensive about where God's responsibility and our own human responsibility coincide. So as we think of the litany, who shall perish by fire or by water, by sword or by beast, by hunger, by thirst, by earthquake, by plague, who shall be secure, who shall be driven, who shall be tranquil, who shall be troubled, who shall be poor, who shall be rich, who shall be humbled, who exalted. I'd like to imagine that there's a different way to understand where is God in all those. And I know if you say to me, but even the storm, if it comes to a place where they're prepared, there will still be both illness and sometimes death. But I'd like to imagine a Talmudic text, I don't want to imagine, I actually want to cite it for you, where the rabbis actually found the ability to see acts of nature as morally neutral. The ability to see what happens in the course of, the arcs of nature as things that really deeply affect us, but not only to be viewed as acts of punishment or divine causality. So for me, this is redemptive of a tradition. It's redemptive of a way to understand God and a way to understand acts of God. So the text is in Avodah Zorah 54b. It's a text I hope many of us have studied. So the frame is the following. It says, the rabbis ask, if a person stole a measure of wheat and sowed it in the ground, it would be right if that wheat would not grow, right? Because it was stolen. So it should self-destruct, right? Because you shouldn't be able to take the wheat and plant it because it wasn't your wheat, but lo and behold, you're going to get wheat and you're going to be able to feed your family on what you stole. It's not right, the text proclaims. But then the answer is, Olam keminhago noheg. The world has its way of just acting, and it's not always a moral universe, and certainly when it comes to nature. So that's simply the divine course of a universe, but here it is nature simply doing what is intrinsic to nature. The next one they bring up in the text in Avodah Zarah is, if a man has intercourse with his neighbor's wife, it would be right that she should not conceive. But nature pursues its own course. Olam keminhago noheg. And out of an adulterous relationship, a child is born. It offends our moral sensibilities, and we wish it were not so. But the rabbis are constructing a frame of theological experience that is not moral or immoral, but amoral. It is not subjected, the laws of nature are not subjected to specific causality in terms of reward and punishment. So the argument goes. So let me give you just two heralds who have, I think, very powerful ways to frame that. One herald is here on this coast, and he's all of our teacher, Harold Schulweis. And the other herald is on the other coast, Harold Kushner. And so Rabbi Schulweis is able to frame from this text. He says that this means that not everything that happens in the world is a divine judgment from a moral judge. He says DNA is not a judgment. The DNA we inherit is neither praiseworthy nor blameworthy. It's simply a fact, a remarkable but nevertheless an amoral fact. The shifting plates that produce earthquakes are not judgments. They are not moral decrees. An earthquake is not God's verdict. The hurricane is not a punishment. So if you know Harold Kushner, you know that his theological tact, again, born out of his own personal pain with the death of his own son, Aaron, from progeria, the disease of rapid aging. The Rabbi Kushner says, I no longer hold God responsible for illnesses, accidents, and natural disasters. Why? Because I realize I gain little and lose so much when I blame God for those things. I can worship a God who hates suffering but cannot eliminate it more easily than I can worship a God who chooses to make children suffer and die for whatever exalted reasons. So I give you these to say that it is possible for us to see God as not the cause of our misfortunes. Some are caused by bad luck, some are caused by bad people, and some are caused by an inevitable consequence of our human lives being mortal. living in a world of inflexible natural laws. This hardly means that I will succeed in having my insurance company cover natural disasters, but I would love for them to cease blaming such events on God. So I don't mind that, we had to actually put a significant amount of money into our home to repair things, but I don't know how we repair the faith that is shattered, because too many people in our society and even in our communities can't imagine what acts of God are apart from these acts of nature. So who shall live and who shall die is not only for God to answer, it's our question as well. So much of the pain and death that we will experience in the coming year is our responsibility. Mark Twain said, "There are many scapegoats for our blunders, but the most popular one is providence." Who shall live and who shall die is not just a theological question, but a moral challenge to each and every one of us. There is much misfortune in this world that we can do nothing about. That is not what I am teaching you today, and what literally makes sense to me as well. But when we compound misfortune by our lethargy or by our moral blindness, it becomes an injustice. And yes, our world is filled with moral injustice, more than we care to see. So acts of God are potentially all around us. The new year could be filled with a litany of acts of God that we can perform as God's agents, not in the natural disasters, but in the godly deeds we are willing to perform for God's hungry, neglected, uninsured, and unprotected children. And I pray that the coming year 5774 will be filled with such godly deeds and far less injustice. Who shall live and who shall die? In most instances, it is up to us. I want to stay, if we could, in the area of sermons that talk about the world that we live in, the issues that we struggle with, the faith that sometimes is challenged. I want to make reference to Rabbi David Hartman of blessed memory. I know that many of us in the room were students of David's, and many of us literally owe Rabbi Hartman our rabbinic lives. And there are a lot of things, and I know we spent, those who were in Israel this summer at the Hartman Institute, we spent a lot of time talking about David's legacy to all of us. And I think there are a lot of legacies, and I look forward to learning more Torah from all of you about the legacy that you carry from Rabbi Hartman. But I think that, there's an audacity to Rabbi Hartman that was both endearing and sometimes overwhelming. And his own rabbinate and the Machon are built on ideas, and are built on the most essential, religious questions and the most serious attempts to answer those questions. And I hope that each of us, in whatever way we were touched by Rabbi Hartman, will not just keep alive what we learned from Rabbi Hartman, but that discipline about being really serious when it comes to the way in which we conceptualize Jewish tradition. A lot of books, a lot of teachings, a lot of articles. The God Who Hates Lies, one of the more recent books. But I think just embedded in, misfortune turning to injustice is that literally that obligation to cut through. So, for example, Hartman has this brilliant reading of the Akedah. Again, we've all over-preached the Akedah, I'm sure, to our own detriment, to our congregants' detriment. But Rabbi Hartman does, because he has more audacity than probably all of us combined, what he does is he says that you cannot build a religious system on the Akedah. The human anthropology, the understanding of God, he said, you simply should not and cannot do that. So he literally takes the frame of the Akedah and turns it to the Sodom and Gomorrah story. He puts it into Genesis 18 and talks about what many of us, have given that sermon. But he has the audacity to say that can actually go in the sermon on the Akedah. That literally you can rebuild an entire intellectual worldview, an entire spiritual worldview if we have the ability to learn deeply and to challenge the tradition as well as the people who hold the tradition, oftentimes in a fairly superficial place. I want to move to say a few words about sermons on Israel. I'm really afraid that there won't be nearly enough sermons on Israel, not just in Los Angeles, but everywhere. And you know why you have had the experience that all of us have had, which is that a sermon on Israel too often is a loser for the rabbi, right? Because if it's thought to be a little bit too left, the right goes crazy. If it's too right, the left goes crazy. If it's right in the middle, you didn't say anything. So for a lot of our colleagues, and again, I do this anecdotally, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but I would be afraid actually to see the show of hands. We're going to steer clear. And it's just an act. And by the way, we're going to steer clear of misfortune to injustice. Oh, and by the way, we're going to steer clear of gun violence as a sermon topic. And we're going to steer clear of immigration reform because, you know what, those are really personal views, and we really want to speak to Judaism and not get into all those particular places. And I would just say that I don't understand what else there is to talk about. If Judaism doesn't address the most important questions of our day, then what does it address? So I'm not going to suggest what that sermon on Israel, I'm going to suggest what I'm going to say, but I'm not going to suggest it's for anyone else to say what I think. But it is a moment our congregations need to hear what each of us thinks. And how do we actually talk about it? Do we use the frame that I mentioned earlier this morning about Klal Yisrael, about the Kotel, about the change, the tipping point of religious identity, about how when you literally level the playing field here in Los Angeles, everyone can thrive. Orthodox, Reform, Conservative. And if you level the playing field in Israel, I believe the same thing would happen. Judaism would be redeemed if we took religion and politics and disassociated them and allowed that garden to grow. So again, that may be the way to talk about Israel, talk about it in the most positive ways. What I'm troubled by, I heard from some of my colleagues in the Israel Diplomatic Corps, and not our Consul General here in Los Angeles, who is an exemplar of what a leader on behalf of the state of Israel should be not only doing but fostering. But I heard from one member of the Israeli Diplomatic Corps, he said, Rick, you should really let folks in your movement, and particularly the rabbis, know that those sermons about the settlements and those sermons about the Kotel that get everybody so angry are really destructive. So what you should talk about is Startup Nation and the arts. And I said, listen, I'm happy to talk about Startup Nation. It's a great narrative. But if we had the temerity to stand in front of our communities and talk about Israel and only talk about things that went around the really big elephants in the room, hopefully while we're praying on the high holy days, there'll be direct negotiations that will still be moving forward. If, again, we have nothing to say, we may just simply say that we are hopeful and we are going to do what we can to be supportive. That may be all that we want to say, but if we are silent, or we think if we're going to tip the scale towards a two-state solution and that will offend people who really are looking towards a one-state solution, then I think we're really going to be failing not only the test of Jewish leadership, but our congregations need us to weigh in about the most urgent questions. And the question in Israel is this the moment, literally the last moment, to address these questions in terms of reconciliation and the possibility of two states for two peoples? I don't want to be dire. I don't want to suggest it is the last moment. But it may be, if not the last moment, it may be our best moment. And are we going to push the Israeli government to do something that she doesn't want to do? Not a chance, because it ain't going to happen. But are we going to bring our collective Jewish voices to say that obviously Israel's viability is key, her security is key, and her security depends on their building not just wonderful new Patriot missile batteries, but the ability to live in the most dangerous neighborhood on the planet. So I think the choice of what we choose to say is key. But here's to me the big takeaway when I think about sermons on Israel. I am offended when I hear over and over again that we are not pro-Israel enough in some part of the spectrum. I think we need to reclaim that pro-Israel has literally hundreds of stances. Pro-Israel has a myriad of issues in focus. So when we talk about standing up for Israel, of course, I am someone who would say wholeheartedly, thank God for AIPAC. And I would say wholeheartedly, thank God for J Street. Thank God for the American Jewish Committee. Thank God for Women of the Wall. Thank God for, we could keep the litany going and name all the ways that we communally stand up for Israel and affirm communally that there's more than one way to do that. And the litmus tests would say that there's literally one definition of pro-Israel, one way to express it, and even giving a sermon on Women of the Wall would be in a sense, an abdication of our responsibility to speak positively. I think our engagement requires us not only to think positively, but constructively and smartly and wisely about Israel. And the host of issues are critical. And the way in which we'll do it, you'll give the beautiful frame that'll come from the traditional first day reading. Or you'll use the framework from using Hatikva as your actual text. Or you'll use a powerful contemporary Zionist text. But you'll use something to help the community know that we have many ways to love Israel, we have many ways to be pro-Israel, and we have an obligation to learn how to speak much more respectfully and be able to take stands. I was, a few years ago, on the board of UJ Federation in New York. And we were having by the way, a small, intimate group of a board. We had 250 people on the board. And we were talking, it was actually while Tzipi Livni was the leader of the opposition. And a member of our board raised her hand and said, Tzipi Livni is going to be in New York next month. We should invite her to come speak to the board of UJ Federation. And there was kind of a groundswell among the board that, well, we shouldn't do that. Why the argument went? Because she's the leader of the opposition. And it would be an expression of disloyalty and lack of support for Israel at a very vulnerable time. And I, again, I was just a shul rabbi, so I didn't have to worry about not getting the job as chair of the board of UJ Federation. I just said, excuse me. But the spectrum of views that we need to not only occasionally hear from, but regularly engage with. Tzipi Livni is like, she's in the center of it. That spectrum actually has to get widened out. And if we can't agree wholeheartedly and instantaneously to invite Tzipi Livni to speak to our board, we are in deep, deep trouble. Now I tell you that story because you could say, well, here in LA, we would never have that kind of issue. And in my synagogue, you may say we would never have that issue, but I can tell you anecdotally of the colleagues who literally have their jobs hanging by a thread because they have a strong voice somewhere in that spectrum, and we've not created the ability to have those conversations. By the way, I don't think a sermon just on having conversations is much of a sermon. I think you actually have to say something in the midst of that. But it would be our collective responsibility to create the climate of opinion. And if I'm going to give my strong sermon about the peace process, or I'm going to give my strong sermon about pluralism in the Jewish state, I better also include some of that, diversity of opinion. Not that I'm going to, find the teachings of someone who is a non-pluralist, like Rabbi Shmuel Eliyahu, who I mentioned. I don't mean that, but I mean getting inside of the real complexity, at the same time be able to say something, so as not to just sort of say platitudes or just say we hope and we pray for peace, which of course I hope we all do. But more than that is required, I believe. And if we're going to have consul generals like David Siegel literally going to bat and helping to create a whole network, we better find in our pulpits, with our tradition and our text and our liturgy and our parshiot, the ability to craft a language that embeds Israel into the lives and hearts of our community, and not just on the newspaper headlines or on the legislation that we love or hate. So the ability to do that, to foster that, is the ultimate goal. But I believe that deep engagement with Israel, the honest engagement, all the warts, all the joys, all the incredible miracles, all the remarkable things and all the challenges, that engagement leads to deeper commitment and a commitment to make Israel all that it is in our hearts, in our dreams, in our prayers. So for me, I'll state, and I'll state over and over again, that there are many ways to stand up for Israel, and please God, in our communities, people should find at least one way to stand up for Israel. It may be with the New Israel Fund. It may be with the pluralism work. It may be with, ACRI, the Association for Civil Rights. It may be with Stand With Israel. It may be the David's Project. It may be the American Friends of Everything, right? We have an American Friends of Everything in Israel. But that people find some way to express a positive engagement to build something, and that we not judge those whose pro-Israel engagement and activism does not exactly resemble our own. I think that can be built in community. I spent 30 years as a congregational rabbi, so this is not mythic to me. It is real. I think it is a desperately important moment for us to construct those kinds of conversations and those kinds of honest reflections about where Israel is. I like to draw it around Jewish unity and diversity. I think those are the frames that speak to me. And I think that we need, I was just in Northern California, and I can tell you the temperature in the room about Israel was so far left that literally I think I felt like Jabotinsky in the room. And when I feel myself in such a room, I sometimes talk in Jabotinsky-like language, because I think it's really important for people to hear that. I also find myself in parts of North America and also in Israel where I feel myself to be, the farthest side of the other spectrum. And I think the ability to put ourselves in those places and to make sure that we know that disengagement from Israel and disaffection and disconnection is probably the greatest danger that we have with Israel, and our unwillingness or inability to find a constructive voice to speak our love for Israel and to always speak our critique as from a place of deep personal responsibility and love. And it always, in my experience, always has to have that part that doesn't live in all of our congregants and all that would be with, that Israel is inside the core of who we are. And when Israel is in that place, the sermon is heard differently, it's spoken differently, and it has a different impact. So for me, I'll never back down from my commitment to a secure Israel. That's not a given. And when people tell me, and they just told me in Northern California, that Israel is not vulnerable, au contraire, Israel has real deep security needs, and I need to be responsible for that. I'm never going to stop fighting for an Israel that grants all of its citizens, Arabs and Jews, fundamental human rights. That's a whole sermon. I'll never stop working for an Israel that grants equal rights to Jews, no matter their spiritual practice or belief. I don't know how that can be a controversial thing to stand up for. I'll never stop advocating for the U.S. to remain Israel's staunch ally, and I will not back away from my commitment to a two-state solution, living side by side in peace and security. And when Israel gets into our hearts, then I know that we will never stop fighting for an Israel that is secure, religiously free, guided by justice, and dwelling in peace. Amen. Thank you. So we probably have time for a few short questions, no long statements, just because I know people have many rabbinic responsibilities to get to. So let's, Laura.
I want to go back to your time, Tokef, and ask the question. I don't think I heard you tell us where God was. I heard where we were and our responsibility. I heard where nature was. But you said that it is a partnership, and it wasn't clear where God is in that partnership.
Right. Well, I think the question of, to really, for me, the key component of the Torah is to actually disassociate for my own personal wrestling, and I think a few others who haven't quite found their way in, to disassociate God from that role of somehow acting through nature in these, quote, blind and random events. But for me, my theological grounding, again, you invite me back, in 10 years, I would be happy to talk about where, my grounding is. And for me, a God that is the Sovev Kol Haaretz and Kol Ha'olam, the one who supports and it is integrated into my experience, but not who is literally outside the realm or the day-to-day reality of the universe. So for me, the theism of our liturgy and the theism of lots of our texts are quite difficult. But for me, the godly acts are the way in which we are the exemplars and the messengers and the deliverers, the hands of God, the mouths of God, to be able to do and create and to shape the world as God wants. But the idea of kind of divine reward and punishment is to me theology that does not resonate, and that's the sermon is to disassociate that, and in its place to allow, whether it's the Hasidic or mystical tradition or some of the other theological elements of our ancient tradition and some of the newer ones. But I think you almost have to make that break and to stop blaming God for what we fail to do, and then find the place where God actually is, which is a huge space. But I think it's different than to see God somehow is the one who is the puppeteer, or the one who is simply using personal experience and nature to cause judgment upon us. So again, a sermon I know can't do everything. It sometimes can't do anything, but it sometimes is a reflection of other sermons that help to construct a religious worldview. I would just say that for many of the people who are the nuns, who are the unaffiliated, rather than just that they don't care, it may be that they haven't heard a way to understand the tradition and are holding on to certain theological and certain biblical texts that just literally cause the disconnect. And it's not from lack of caring, but sometimes actually because of too much caring and too much questioning. So I would ask, in terms of sometimes the way in which we can help redeem the tradition by giving some other ways to experience, understand, and interpret, maybe the way in which we literally lower some of the many boundaries and the barriers that keep people from being a part of our religious community, because they're actually paying attention to what we say and to what we profess. And when we can broaden that and say that there actually are many different ways people can be deeply involved in Jewish life and leadership that does not require certain theological commitments that may in fact be not shared by us in the room and may not be possible for those who are seeking some kind of faith that really nourishes the core of who they are, how they live, how they understand their responsibility in the world. So I would not be saying, again, you could probably use the sermon to make a secularist argument. I'm not making that. I'm just wanting to disassociate one particular kind of theology from a text that is so front and center that literally you can't escape from as you come into the Yamim Noraim. And I think it's an act of reclaiming the tradition that I think is one of the biggest ways we will get those barriers down. And not only new people come, but even the people who are there who are not feeling that it speaks to their deepest religious longings and deepest religious questions. We got one last question.
How can we respond to the assertion that Women of the Wall and efforts to bring egalitarianism in Israel is a North American concern?
Well, there are other people who would say that democracy may be a North American thing, but it's a pretty important part of the Israeli experience. I actually think that that's where it's really important to make a pivot. I think the pivot for us in Israel is that most Israelis, again, more are paying attention, but for most secular Israelis, Kotel just is not part of their lives. And they're not bothered by what happens, they've simply accepted it. But if you talk about civil marriage, you talk about the freedom to marry, you talk about the funding of religious institutions, you talk about the things that do animate that's where I'm afraid, actually, of our long and deep connection this year, particularly to Women of the Wall. I love their work, and we wouldn't be where we are were it not for them. So let us celebrate their leadership. At the end of the day, it's not about the kotel, because in Israel, you'll definitely get folks in almost every community that will talk about the ways in which the religious establishment is at times choking, at times disaffecting. And I think what we need is the sermons, and again for me, the pivot is to use the awakening around Women of the Wall to see the larger issue of pluralism in Israel and here. That's the big takeaway. If it was just about the kotel, frankly, I don't think we should be spending as much time on it as we are. But because the kotel is symbolic of everything, and it's literally so rich in symbolic power, that talking about it is the opportunity to move to the other related issues. By the way, North Americans, most of our folks, civil marriage, they don't know what you're talking about. What would that do in Israel? They don't have that sense, but they know that a woman praying the Shema out loud with the talit, that's an affront. So we've got to take the righteous indignation of North American Jewry and translate it into what's really needed and effective and important in Israel. And by the way, if egalitarianism is somehow an import from outside of Israel, that's not a bad thing as well. There are plenty of things that come in the history of ideas, the history of the human race that don't grow from within, that we can actually not only embrace but may in fact become critical to our lives, like democracy and Judaism. And a Jewish democratic state is one of those things that for me is the bottom line, not so much for some people who are discussing these issues. So it doesn't automatically have to be a negative that something comes from, chutz la'aretz, but it is certainly the case if we want to talk meaningfully, we better get to the issues that burn inside of Israelis. And when you walk around Israel and you meet particularly disaffected secular Israelis, they don't get what the tumult is about the Western Wall, but they do get where the disconnect is between the Jewish tradition and their lives, especially around key moments like wedding, like around divorce, like around conversion. So I think we really have to get to the really critical issues, and it's our opportunity on the holidays to make sure that we've broadened and not allow them to come with the kotel and leave with the kotel, but leave with a broader sense of what's really at stake and what we really have to be working on. And then we have something that's a winner. So let me say, first of all, thank you for this opportunity. A sweet, a joyful, a courageous, imaginative new year filled with all the things that we need individually to do our work and that our Jewish community desperately needs from each of us. So kol hakavod for the leadership, for the work, and I look forward to being partners as we shape the Jewish future one year at a time. Thank you.